The mahogany door of the Westbrook Tower slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the executive suite. Marcus Westbrook stood at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking downtown, his phone still pressed to his ear, the voice of his attorney still crackling through the speaker like an accusation. "The documents are legitimate, Marcus. I've had 3 separate firms verify them. She owns 49% of Westbrook Technologies. Not earned, not granted, inherited." Marcus's hand clenched into a fist. Through the glass, the city sprawled beneath him. Buildings he'd built, companies he'd absorbed, an empire constructed brick by brick through cutthroat negotiations and ruthless ambition. And the woman who slept in his bed, who smiled at him over breakfast, who'd been pulling his company's strings from the shadows all along, owned nearly half of it. How is that possible? His voice was barely a whisper. "I've known her for 3 years. We've been married for 18 months. We've shared everything." "That's what you need to ask her," his attorney replied, "because according to these documents, she's known exactly who you were the day you met her." The call ended. Marcus stood alone in the darkness, watching his reflection fracture across the glass. Outside, the city glittered with the life he'd built from nothing. Inside, everything was crumbling. It had started, like so many catastrophes do, with an act of kindness. 3 years earlier, Marcus Westbrook had been at the absolute apex of his career. At 42, he'd built Westbrook Technologies from a basement startup into a $5 billion artificial intelligence powerhouse. He'd survived 2 divorces, countless betrayals, and a handful of near-death experiences in the corporate world. He'd learned to trust no one. He'd perfected the art of seeing people as either assets or obstacles. That autumn night, he'd been driving home from a charity gala in his Mercedes when he saw her huddled beneath the overpass on 5th Street. Most people didn't see homeless people anymore. The city had trained its eyes to slide past them like ghosts. But Marcus saw her because she was reading a book, not a newspaper, not cardboard with a plea written in marker. A book, an actual hardcover copy of Thinking Fast and Slow. He'd stopped the car, backed up, pulled over to the shoulder. "That's a dense read for casual browsing," he'd said, rolling down the window. She'd looked up, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She had dark hair that hadn't seen a brush in days, intelligent eyes that held the kind of clarity that poverty rarely permitted, and cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. She was also clearly terrified, a woman alone, late at night, approached by a strange man in an expensive car. "It's a good book," she'd said carefully. "Helps pass the time." "What's your name?" "Elena." "Elena, I'm Marcus, and before you ask, I'm not offering you money for anything inappropriate. I'm offering you a hot meal and a place to sleep tonight that isn't under an overpass." She'd studied him for a long moment. Why? It was a fair question. Marcus had studied himself the same way dozens of times in the years that followed. Why had he stopped? Why had he cared? Why had he invited her into his life when his life was a carefully controlled ecosystem designed to eliminate variables and uncertainty? He'd never found a satisfactory answer. Elena had accepted his offer with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness always came with a price. What she didn't know was that Marcus Westbrook had just made the most reckless decision of his carefully calculated life. The next morning, she'd tried to leave. He'd insisted she stay for breakfast. She'd asked about staying for a week. 6 months later, she was still there, and Marcus had discovered something he'd never believed existed. A person he didn't need to manipulate, control, or strategically position. he could simply be himself with her. Elena never asked about his money. She read in his library. She took walks in his gardens. She cooked elaborate meals from recipes she loved. She laughed at his jokes and challenged his worldview and made him feel like a human being rather than a ruthless acquisition machine. When he'd proposed, a year into her living with him, she'd cried. "I'm nothing," she'd whispered against his chest. "I was nobody when you found me." "You were somebody before you were homeless," he'd replied. "I've seen it. The way you think. The way you move through the world. Something happened to you. Something put you under that overpass. But that's not who you are." She'd never told him the full story. She'd given him fragments, a family estrangement, poor decisions, a series of circumstances that had spiraled. But there were holes in her narrative, gaps where Marcus's instincts told him something didn't add up. He'd ignored those instincts because, for the first time in his life, he wanted to believe in someone without verification, without proof, without contingencies. It was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. The revelation had come during a routine securities audit. The investigating team had been tracing historical claims and legacy stakes when they'd discovered an unusual distribution. Decades earlier, Marcus's grandmother had established a trust. The beneficiary was listed as the future wife of Marcus Westbrook III. Not a wife of his choosing. The future wife, as if the settlement had been predetermined. His grandmother had been eccentric, brilliant, and deeply strategic. She'd built the initial tech infrastructure that would eventually become Westbrook Technologies. She'd also apparently orchestrated a plan that wouldn't come to fruition until after her death. A plan that designated 49% of the company to whoever married her grandson. The trust had never been activated because Marcus's 2 previous marriages had produced prenups that eliminated any claim. But his marriage to Elena had no prenup. More than that, Elena had legally changed her name from Reyes to Westbrook. The trust's language was specific enough to interpret that as qualifying. For 18 months, she'd been entitled to nearly half the company. She simply hadn't claimed it. That was what kept Marcus awake that night, not the betrayal of her identity, but the fact that she hadn't used it. She'd had leverage, control, and power, and she'd said nothing. She'd asked for nothing. She'd simply existed in his life as if she were just a woman he'd married, which meant either she didn't know or she was playing the longest game in corporate history. Marcus called his investigator at midnight. "I need everything, every financial transaction, every contact, every moment of her life before I met her. I need to know who she really is." What he discovered would have devastated most men. It devastated Marcus, but it also forced him to confront a question that terrified him more than any business failure. What did he actually know about love? The investigator's report came back in 2 days. Elena Reyes had been the daughter of a prominent family, the Reyes family, which had made its fortune in international finance and technology consulting. She'd been brilliant, educated at Stanford, trained in both finance and computer science. She'd been positioned to take over the family business until, at 28, a scandal had emerged. She'd discovered her father had been funneling company assets into illegal overseas accounts. When she'd threatened to report it, her family had cut her off completely. Not just disowned, erased. They'd frozen her accounts, blacklisted her from the industry, and ensured that no one would hire her. Her own brother had testified against her in a civil suit, claiming she was mentally unstable. Within a year, she'd lost everything. The legal fees had drained her savings. The psychological warfare had shattered her confidence. The isolation had made her invisible. She'd ended up under an overpass with a book about psychology, trying to understand how her own family had turned her into a ghost. And then Marcus had stopped his car. The investigator's final note was brief. Subject appears to have no knowledge of the trust. No financial advisors, no lawyers, no evidence of strategic planning. The marriage appears to have been genuine from her perspective. Whether she discovered the trust after the ceremony is unclear. No accounts show unusual activity. Marcus read that note a dozen times, and then he drove to the beach house where Elena had gone to think after he'd told her about the audit, about the discovery, about the fact that she was worth nearly $3 billion. He found her on the deck at sunset, wrapped in a cashmere throw, staring at the ocean. "Did you know?" His voice was rough. "Before you married me. Did you know about the trust?" Elena turned to face him. Her eyes were red from crying, but her gaze was steady. "No, I didn't know until 3 weeks ago." His stomach dropped. 3 weeks? Your family lawyer called. My name in the system triggered an automated notification. He explained what my grandmother-in-law had done, what I was entitled to. She paused. "Marcus, I turned it down." Marcus couldn't process that. "You what?" "I had the papers drawn up to refuse the entire inheritance, to sign everything back over to you. But I realized—" She trailed off, looking back at the ocean. "If I did that, you'd never believe I married you for love. You'd never trust that any of this was real. So I kept it. I kept the right to 49%, but I'm not claiming it. I'm not activating it. I'm not using it. I'm just keeping it safe." That doesn't make any sense. "No, it doesn't," Elena agreed. "It's insane. It gives me massive power over your company, and I'm choosing not to use it. But that's the only way I can prove to you that I didn't marry you for your money. That I didn't know about the trust when I said yes. That when you found me under that overpass, I was genuinely just a woman reading a book, because it helped me forget my life was falling apart." Marcus sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "Why would you keep it if you're not going to use it?" "Because your grandmother was smarter than both of us," Elena said. "She set this up as a test, didn't she? She wanted to know if whoever you married was worthy of being part of the empire she built. And the only way to pass that test is to have the power and refuse to use it. The only way to prove you love someone is to have leverage and give it away." Marcus looked at this woman he'd married, this woman he thought he'd saved, who'd actually been saving herself all along. "I don't know how to trust you." "Then don't," Elena said simply. "But also, don't assume you can't. I'm asking you to believe me. Not because it's logical, not because it makes business sense, but because sometimes people are exactly who they claim to be. Sometimes kindness is just kindness. Sometimes love is just love." The sun dropped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Marcus thought about everything he'd built, all the walls he'd constructed, every decision he'd made based on the assumption that everyone wanted something from him. He thought about the night he'd stopped under that overpass and seen a woman reading a book. He thought about the breakfast he'd insisted on, the home he'd offered, the person she'd become in his life. "I had you investigated," he confessed. "Your entire history, every contact, every moment." "I know," Elena said. "I had someone watching you, too." Marcus turned to stare at her. "What? Not to hurt you, not to trap you, to make sure you were real, to make sure that your kindness wasn't part of some larger game." She reached over and took his hand. "Marcus, I've been betrayed by everyone I trusted. My family, my colleagues, the people who were supposed to love me. When you stopped your car, I thought it was another trap. I watched you for months, waiting for the moment you'd demand payment in some form. But you never did. You just let me be. Marcus squeezed her hand. I was going to build a case against you. My lawyers are drawing up documents. I was going to have you sign away the entire inheritance. I was going to make you prove your love by forcing you to have nothing. I know that too, Elena said, but here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to trust me. Not because I've earned it, not because I've passed some test, but because if you don't, then we've both wasted the best thing that either of us has ever had. The silence stretched between them, deep and vast as the ocean. I need to think, Marcus finally said. Then think, Elena replied. But think while holding my hand. I'm not going anywhere. He did think. For weeks, he thought. He reviewed the evidence of her life before him. He saw the pattern of destruction orchestrated by her family. He understood for the first time what real sacrifice looked like. And he realized that Elena had sacrificed more than just money. She'd sacrificed the power to make him believe her. She could have used the trust as leverage. She could have demanded a position in the company, demanded influence, demanded respect. Instead, she'd chosen to be vulnerable. She'd chosen to stand in front of him with nothing but the truth of who she was and hope that it would be enough. 3 months later, Marcus Westbrook made a decision that shocked the business world. He promoted Elena to Chief Operating Officer of Westbrook Technologies, not as a symbolic position, not as an ornament, as an executive with complete authority and responsibility. Her appointment came with an announcement that she'd inherited a significant stake in the company through her marriage. The board was skeptical until they watched her in her first meeting, a woman who understood the business at a level that most executives never achieved, who had insights into structural problems that no one else had, spotted, who led with both intelligence and compassion. Within a year, Westbrook Technologies had expanded into 3 new markets. Within 2 years, it had become the most ethically operated tech company in the world, a distinction that Marcus had never cared about until Elena showed him why it mattered. And on the night of the annual shareholder meeting, Marcus stood beside his wife at the podium and said something he'd never expected to say. I came to this company with a hunger for power. I was willing to do whatever it took to build something no one else could touch. I succeeded. But I was alone. Until Elena came into my life, I believed that success meant isolation, that trust was weakness, that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. He paused, looking at her. Elena taught me that the greatest success is building something with someone you love, not for the company, not for the shareholders, but because when you're building with someone, the act of creation becomes more valuable than anything you could ever create alone. Elena squeezed his hand. In the audience, people who'd spent their entire careers with Marcus Westbrook saw something they'd never seen before, a man who was genuinely, completely happy. The homeless woman under the overpass had become the most powerful woman in one of the world's most influential companies. But more importantly, she'd become the woman who taught a billionaire that the only wealth that really mattered was the kind you could share. As they left the stage, Elena whispered, "You know your grandmother orchestrated this entire thing, right? She knew you'd be broken and lost until you found someone who understood that the greatest fortune isn't measured in money." Marcus laughed, a real, surprised laugh. "You think she could see the future?" I think she understood human nature better than anyone I've ever met, Elena said. And she knew that the only thing that could save Marcus Westbrook III was having to choose love over power, having to believe in something that didn't make logical sense. "And did I make the right choice?" Marcus asked. Elena smiled, the same smile he'd seen for the first time under that overpass, when a kind stranger had offered a terrified woman a chance at redemption. "Every single day," she said. "Every single day, you choose me. And that's the most valuable thing you've ever owned."